Queen Esther lived at a time when one of the greatest challenges to the Jewish people ever existed. And there was a moment when it looked like the entire Jewish people would be destroyed from the face of the earth if Esther didn't act. The Jewish people went into exile under the Babylonians. The Babylonians were the great empire at the time. They overtook Jerusalem. They overtook the Jewish people and carried them out into exile. 50 years later, the Persian Empire arose. The Persians not only conquered the Babylonians, but the Persian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen. And King Xerxes, as we heard in the passage, who was actually Xerxes I, who went up against the Spartans at Thermopylae. Go back and watch the movie, what's it called? The 300. Yeah. King Xerxes I ruled over the kingdom of Persia, the empire of Persia. The scripture says it stretched from India all the way to Ethiopia. It covered Turkey, Persia, anywhere in the Middle East, up into Egypt. The empire of Xerxes I was the largest the world had ever seen, 127 provinces. And King Xerxes I, in the third year of his reign, called all of the governors and all of the military to Susa, the capital city, and there he presided over a 180-day banquet, half the year, where everybody feasted, and there was gold rings, and there were golden goblets, and there was cotton hanging over the windows, and there was music. It was festival like the world had never seen before. And after that, he called all of the regular citizens together for a 7-day banquet. And there was eating and there was drinking, and Xerxes presided over all of it. And then he called to his queen, Queen Vashti, to put on her royal robes, to put on the royal crown, and to come and to stand there next to them that all the world could see her beauty and her dignity. And Queen Vashti said no to the emperor of Persia. The emperor was filled with rage, called his people together. He said, "What should be done?" They said, "My goodness, this will lead to rebellion, open rebellion. If people think that people can defy your word, even all the way up to the queen, then you will sow dissent throughout the empire." And so Queen Vashti was banished, never to be seen again. And the emperor called out and called for unmarried women throughout the entire empire, 127 provinces, for single women to be gathered together, to be given the opportunity, one of them to become his queen. And all of those who came forward included Esther, who was adopted by Mordecai, who served there in Susa. Esther had no father, Esther had no mother, but her cousin Mordecai had adopted her, cared for her, raised her up in his house. Mordecai was close to the king's palace, and he brought Esther forward and made sure that she was seen and that she was given this great opportunity. And so she was brought in to the great crowd. And for 10 months, the women were given the best beauty treatments that the world had to offer. They were given food, they were given attendance. And because Esther pleased the person who was caring for her, he made sure also that she was given first priority. And when the emperor, after 10 months, came to look at all of the women, his eyes fell on Esther. And after spending some time with her, he was touched and moved by her. And he said, "Esther, I choose Esther to become my queen." And so Esther was given the royal robes, and Esther was given the crown. But don't let yourself think that she was somehow an equal to Emperor Xerxes. We see that with Vashti. The emperor was capricious. He could make any decision he wanted at any time. And she was in some ways a servant, although a royal servant, and given quite a lot of space and opportunity to herself. And every day Mordecai would stand at the gates, and he would give guidance or support to Esther. She would send her attendants out, any kind of consultation that she might need, or ideas or encouragement. He would send forth through the servants, and Esther would hear those things. One One day when Mordecai was there standing at the gate, he noticed that two of the king's attendants, who were given authority by the king, were both furious, and they seemed to have swords in their robes, which they were not supposed to have. He listened closely and realized that they had a plan to assassinate the emperor. And so when the attendants came, he sent word to Esther through the attendants. He said, "These people are planning to assassinate Emperor Xerxes. You must get him word." And she brings word to the emperor crediting Mordecai. And the emperor goes out, and lo and behold, these two attendants were planning a great assassination. And so they were captured, and they were hung on the gallows. And all of this was written in the book of the king's records. Well, Mordecai, as he was standing at the gates, happened to be standing there on a day when Haman, one of the king's royal sort of like leaders, had just been given a great promotion. Haman had been raised up above everybody else so that he was essentially the Secretary of State, the emperor's right-hand man. And Xerxes had pronounced that everywhere that Haman went, everyone should bow before him. Not by ones or twos only, but by hundreds and by thousands. Everywhere that Haman went, people should bow down and pay obeisance. And when Haman would come into the courts, people noticed that Mordecai never bowed. Mordecai never bowed. And they came to Mordecai and they said, "The king has ordered that everyone must bow." And Mordecai simply said, "I am a Jew." Interestingly, in the book of Esther, the name of God is never mentioned, and yet it is constantly present below the surface. We can understand why Mordecai, as a Jew, would refuse to bow before a human being. Word was given to Haman. This is called gossip, because Haman hadn't noticed. But Haman now started looking, and he would see crowds of people, hundreds, thousands of people bowing. But he saw the one guy who wouldn't now. He saw Mordecai, and he was furious. Nothing else mattered. The promotion didn't matter. No, everybody else bowing didn't matter. If Mordecai wouldn't bow, then none of it made a difference at all. Haman goes to King Xerxes, and he says to him, "Xerxes, great and powerful Xerxes, there is a people who have sowed themselves among all the populations of your provinces, people who have been scattered about, but they follow their own laws, and they follow their own ways, and they refuse to follow the command of the king." Because, of course, the king had commanded everyone should bow, and Mordecai would not. And Xerxes said, "What? How is this possible?" And Haman said, "Let me give you 10,000 talents of silver, and give me authority, and I will cast lots and choose a date, and on that date we will destroy, kill, and annihilate this people, so that they shall never cause the king harm or dishonor again." And Xerxes thought, "I don't like people against me, and 10,000 talents doesn't sound bad." And he gives Haman the ring, and he says, "Do as you wish." And Haman creates a decree, and the decree is sent out to the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire, to each place in its own language. It is written down in script. It's put into the pockets of riders and messengers who carry it all throughout the empire, that on the 12th month and the 13th day, everyone is given authority to rise up against the Jews in their land, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate them. And when Mordecai hears about this command, he is cut to the heart. The scripture says he's going through the city of Susa, wailing in sackcloth and ashes. And when Esther hears about what Mordecai is doing, she sends out clothes to him so that he could wear normal clothes. And Mordecai refuses the clothes. He tells the attendants what has just been done and pleads with Esther, please to do something about it. Go and talk to Xerxes. But of course, Xerxes is the most powerful emperor the world has ever seen. And anybody who just walks up to the emperor because they have an idea ends up losing their head. Esther finds a way to gather with Mordecai. to get together face to face. She says, how can I do this? He'll kill me if I even walk into his presence. There's no way that I can do this. And Mordecai looks her in the eye in some of the most important words in Scripture. He says, Esther, if you keep silent at a time such as this, God will raise up deliverance for the Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's house will be destroyed. He said, but who knows? Maybe you have been raised up into royal dignity for just such a time as this. And those words, who knows? Maybe you've been put here. Maybe you've been given this opportunity. Maybe you're in this place for just such a time as this so you can make the difference. You could imagine Esther just sort of getting goosebumps. She says to Mordecai, invite all of the Jews of the capital city to fast with me for 3 days, to eat nothing, to drink nothing. And Esther goes, and for 3 days she eats nothing and she drinks nothing. And all of them are praying, but it never mentions why or to whom or what they say. But all of them clearly sort of laying out themselves before God and just praying that all of the pieces would come together just right. And when the 3 days were up, Esther gathers her courage, she puts on the royal robes, she goes into the inner court, and she just stands there. She does not rush the emperor, she does not surprise him, she goes into the royal court and just stands and waits where she's not supposed to be. And when Xerxes finally sort of she catches his eye, catches her eye, he looks at her, and perhaps for a moment he's confused or even furious, and then he's curious. And Esther had won his favor after all. And so he calls Esther forward. And Esther comes forward. He says, Esther, what can I do for you? I'll give you anything, Esther. Even ask me anything, even to half of my kingdom. And Esther says to him, if it pleases the king, I'm using king and emperor interchangeably. If it pleases the king, if it seems right to you and something you want to do, will you come to my place tonight for a banquet and bring Haman? Now, I don't know if she chickened out or if she's preparing the way. You get to decide. The scripture, this one doesn't interpret itself. And the emperor says, perfect. He tells Haman, who feels like the most important person in the world now, he's like, oh my gosh, it's only me and the emperor and Esther. Haman's thinking, my stock is rising. And they have a banquet that night. And finally the emperor looks at her and says, now what did you really want? Tell me, Esther. And she looks at him and she says, if it pleases the king, if you wouldn't mind, and if it sort of meets your approval and is your own decision, will you come to a banquet tomorrow and bring him? And he says, yes, I will. Haman goes home and tells his whole family about how amazing this is, about how he's doing so good. And then he thinks about Mordecai, and all of it seems worthless. And he says, what should I do? And his family says, you know what? Here's what you should do. Let's build a gallows right in front of our house, 75 feet high. This is what you hang people on, right? And tomorrow morning, as soon as the sun rises, go to Xerxes and convince him to hang Mordecai on the gallows. So they go to sleep, and they wake up the next day, and Haman comes, marching into Xerxes' presence, which he may do as Secretary of State. And Xerxes, before Haman can say a word, Xerxes says to him, Haman, what should the king do for someone he wants to honor? Someone who has pleased the emperor so much that the emperor chooses to just sort of lavish on him praise and authority. What would be right? And Haman gets this big smile. He says, I think you should take a robe that the emperor himself has worn and put it on that person. And a horse that the emperor has ridden and put the person on the robe, on that horse. and then let them be walked throughout the entire capital city in a parade, saying, "This is how Xerxes chooses to honor those who please him." And Xerxes looks at Haman and says, "Perfect. Do that for Mordecai." And Haman says, King says, "Yeah, last night I couldn't sleep. And I said, read the book of the annals of the king. And I remembered that Mordecai had caught those two people who were about to assassinate me. And I never did anything to help him or to reward him. So you, Haman, I want you to take Mordecai and put him on my robe and put him on my horse. And you, Haman, lead him throughout the entire capital city, saying, 'This is how Xerxes chooses to honor those who please him.'" And Haman can hardly believe it. And he does it to the end. And at the end of this great parade, the scripture says he's got his hood over his face. And you could just imagine he's just exhausted from all of the sort of bitter irony of the whole thing. Then he goes to the banquet. And in that banquet, after eating and drinking, Xerxes says to Esther, "Esther, come on. What can I do for you? I will do even to half of my kingdom. What do you choose?" And Esther looks at him with all her courage and she says, "Xerxes," she says, "give me my life. That's what I ask you. And give me the lives of my people. For we have been sold to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." And Xerxes is looking at his queen and thinking, "Who has sold my queen?" He said, "Who has done this? Who would possibly have done this?" And Esther turns and points at Haman and says, "This wicked Haman, a foe and enemy." And Xerxes looks at Haman, and Haman is just sort of, his face just turns white. Xerxes storms out of the room in silence and goes to the royal gardens to figure out what to do with this guy. Meantime, Haman jumps on top of Esther, and he's pleading with her, and he's like doing anything he can, trying to convince her to tell Xerxes that Haman, is not responsible. And Xerxes comes back into the room, and there's Haman on the couch on top of Esther, and Xerxes' head just explodes. He says, "What should be done with this person?" And the attendants say, "Well, right in front of Haman's house are gallows 75 feet high." And Xerxes says, "Hang him on that!" And in that moment, a bag is thrown over Haman's head, and he is never seen again. Everything that's his now falls to Esther. He gives her the authority. And she brings Mordecai into the king's court and takes all of that authority and gives it to Mordecai. And then together they ask the emperor, they say, "Please, can we do something about this command?" And the emperor says, "I can't remove a command I've already done. There is already a command that says on the 12th month and the 13th day, all the enemies of the Jews may rise up, kill, destroy, and annihilate them." He said, "But here's my royal ring. You can write anything you want as another law to be decided." And so Esther and Mordecai, what would you do, right? They get together, you can imagine, the light, and they're sort of writing, and the next morning it goes out, it's written in all the different people's languages, goes out to 127 provinces on horses and on boats and on chariots, all throughout the entire empire. And what it says is on the 12th month and the 13th day, all the Jews in the entire empire are allowed to defend themselves. And anyone who comes against them, they are given the authority to resist them, even to the point of killing them, and are allowed to take all of those people's property as their own. And when the day comes, believe it or not, it's known throughout the kingdom, both laws. And yet on the 12th month and on the 13th day, 75,000 people rise up against the Jewish people all throughout the empire. And in Susa itself, 500 people rise up against the Jewish people. And in every single case, the Jews were ready and they were prepared and they defend themselves even to the point of killing. And to the last one, refused to take the people's property. Because it's not about the money. It's about protection. It's about lineage. It's about dignity. It's about preserving what is right. and standing against what is wrong. And it's so successful that it's allowed for the next day, the 14th day. And on the 15th day, all throughout the kingdom, the Jewish people celebrate because they've been finally allowed to not only exist, but also to exist with dignity, to be known, to let it be known who they are without fear. And to this day, this, on the 12th month and the 15th day, is called the Feast of Purim. And the Jewish people to this very day celebrate this feast annually. And I'm pretty sure they actually read the whole book, which, believe it or not, takes longer than the story I just told. It is told perfectly, and it reads so fast you may want to go home and read it yourself. It's near the end of the Bible because it's one of the last historical books that occur there. In the end, Mordecai becomes the emperor's right-hand man. He has more authority than any Secretary of State ever has. Esther lives a long life as the queen, and the Jewish people, in a time of great turmoil and danger, are protected. The scripture doesn't interpret itself. I think there's a lot of different things to learn here. The gossip part was bad. Standing against God's people, especially when their cause is righteous. I'm not making a political decision. You can choose what that means, but it's probably not a good idea to come against them. It talks about the role of the state to protect religious minorities. It talks about like relationships between men and women, and maybe what makes sense and maybe what doesn't. But ultimately, it's the story of a woman who was in the right place at the right time, whose faith gave her enough courage to risk her own life for the sake of what was right. And